Over 8 million people call New York City home, and with those individuals come many stories. Stories of one of the world's great cities. Our guest tonight spent time walking that city and hearing its stories, and he's here with us now to tell us how the Big Apple has changed over the past 35 years. William Helmreich is a professor of sociology at the Colin Powell Center at City College of New York and Graduate Center. He's also the author of The New York Nobody Knows, Walking 6,000 Miles in New York City. Hello, welcome to Toronto. Welcome to the Agenda
Hi,
Center.
thank you for having me.
6,000 miles, that's about 10,000 K.
Yes.
That's a lot of walking, my friend.
It's a lot of walking.
What inspired you to do this? You're a New Yorker, obviously, but what inspired you to walk your city?
My father. I grew up on the west side of Manhattan, and every weekend when he had time, we played a game. It was called Last Stop. We went to the last stop on the subway, and then we walked around. And when we ran out of last stops, the subway had about 212 miles of system then. When we ran out of last stops, we went to the second to last stop, to the third to last stop. I got a lot of quality time with my father, and at the same time, I learned a tremendous amount about the city. I was such a city kid that when we went to a neighborhood called Throggs Neck, a little rural area by the water in the easternmost reaches of the Bronx, I saw people fishing, and I then learned that fish come out of the water. I had thought they came from the fish store. So we learned a lot. I walked with him once into a place in Brooklyn, and he poked his head into a bar, and everybody scattered. So I learned that my father looked a little like a detective. And I went to Canarsie, Brooklyn, and it was a swampy marsh at the time. Today it's filled in, it's built up with homes. And I remembered that this was where my teacher in the 5th grade had told me he would send me if I misbehaved. Then I realized I didn't want to go there.
Right.
So I covered the city. That inspired me. And then teaching at City College, I had been teaching a course in New York City for maybe 30, 40 years. And my chairman said, why don't you just write a book about it? So I did. And when Princeton was considering the contract, you know, I wrote a proposal saying that I would walk 20 representative streets in New York. As it happened, I soon discovered that I had no basis for claiming that the streets that I had selected were really representative of the city. And so I reluctantly, perhaps not so reluctantly, concluded that I'd have to walk the entire city.
Do you have a plan?
A plan?
Yeah.
Well, I've really walked the city about 16 times because I always walked. My father, who died at the age of 102 3 years ago, kept walking into his 80s, 7, 8 miles a day. And so in my 20s, in my 30s, in my 40s, in my 50s, I always walked the city. So my plan was to walk every single block, lay it out on a grid and walk it. Because when people say they live in a neighborhood, they usually know the 10 blocks of their area, but they don't know the 40 blocks that encompass the entire area. So they'll say I'm from a neighborhood, but they really don't know the entire neighborhood.
You're raised in New York, and then you go and you walk every block of the city, 5 boroughs. What were your impressions before you set out for the walk of New York?
Well, my impressions were that this is a fascinating, eminently walkable city with public transportation and with easy access to all the neighborhoods. And I began in a neighborhood called Flushing, Queens. I ended up in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And how do you walk a whole city? Well, you walk it one step at a time, the way you climb a mountain. So what was it? 30 miles a week on the average, because I did have a full-time job. I didn't quit my day job. 30 miles a week, 120 miles a month, 1,500 miles a year. And before you know it, you're done. 6,048 miles out of 6,360.
And given that you grew up in New York, I mean, as an outsider to New York, and people still tell you, be careful in New York, don't go to certain neighborhoods, don't walk down certain streets. Was that a worry for you at all?
Forget about outsiders. My wife, who's an insider, said to me, I don't like you walking these bad neighborhoods. I don't want you walking in Brownsville and East New York. You're going to get killed. I said, I grew up on the streets of New York. I grew up in a tough neighborhood. I'm not going to get killed. I said, you know what? We're going to Los Angeles to visit our son. We're going to take a walk through some tough neighborhoods there. We're going to go to Compton. We're going to go to Inglewood. We're going to go to Watts. And I said, and at the end, after we finish walking down Crenshaw and Central and Broadway, we're either going to be dead or you're not going to be worried anymore. Do you trust me? And so she said, yes, I trust you. And we walked. Now, what did I do? I'll make it very simple. I used a counterintuitive approach. Whenever I'd see some bad guy, if you want to call it that, I would force the eye contact, and I would say, "How you doing, buddy?" And they would melt because it's counterintuitive. They didn't expect that. They expect me to put on my game face, show some attitude. You
Cross
can't
the
have
street.
attitude in a terrible neighborhood when you're 20 miles inside it. You'll never get out of there alive. And so, also my age. I mean, let's put it this way. You want to make your rep? I'm not worth killing. I'm too old. So people would, they would look at me and they would say, "I don't know what this crazy dude is doing here. Hopefully he's not a cop. Maybe he's too poor. He couldn't leave here," because I was white and a lot of these neighbors were black or Hispanic. And so I knew that those were strategies that I had to use in order to be able to make it through these neighborhoods. I never really encountered a problem. Only one time near the end of the journey, I walked into a housing project. And I did my usual, "How you doing?" They'd say, "Okay, Pops," whatever. But at this time, this 16-year-old guy, that's what I guess his approximate age was, didn't say anything to me. He just looked at me and he said something into a walkie-talkie, and I saw 7 heads bob up across the oval, the grassy oval. And I realized I had probably walked into a drug deal. So I simply said later, walked out as slowly as I could to preserve my dignity, but as quickly as I could to leave. So I won't endorse walking in these neighborhoods and say that anybody can do it. I would say a younger person is at greater risk. A woman is surely at risk, because for a woman to say hello to a man invites trouble sometimes if he doesn't know her and he gets the wrong message. So I was positioned to do it, but I still wouldn't recommend it unless you know what you're doing.
But given your own personal experience and not running into problems, and sort of juxtapose that against the fears that your wife and others have about walking in some neighborhoods, I mean, how much of a concern is crime in New York City today? We know it was a dodgier place in the 70s and 80s, but today, what's it like?
Well, this is a relative question. I talked to a woman outside the Jackson projects on 149th Street and Grand Concourse in the Bronx, a poor neighborhood. And I said to her, "What's it like here?" "Oh, there's terrible crime here. There's terrible crime." I said, "I don't want to say anything to you that you might find off-putting, but in the early 1990s, we had about 2,000, 2,200, 2,300 murders a year. We're down to about 500 now." I said, "That's an 80% drop, or a 75% drop." And I said, "So what do you mean it's so terrible here? Is it really that terrible?" She said, "Well, you know something, mister? You said the crime is down to 500? Well, I just want you to know one thing. If there is 500 murders happening a year in New York City, 400 of them is happening outside my window." So you see, it's relative to the neighborhood. But what happened? What caused crime to drop? I mean, New York today is surely the safest big city in the United States. We had 414 murders last year. And for a city of 8.3 million, that's really not a lot. So what is it that changed? There are many, many theories, but I have to say, no matter what your ideology is, police enforcement is really the main reason. We had CompStat, we spotted out neighborhoods that were high crime areas. I mean, the problem is that when it comes to solving the crime, people on the liberal side of the spectrum will say we need more opportunities. But if you're going to give people dead-end jobs in McDonald's, that's not an opportunity. You say jobs? What are those jobs? You're going to be an executive in a corporation? So that isn't such a motivating force. Conservatives say lock them up. Lock them up hasn't solved the crime problem. There are still so many people who are committing crimes, and there are still so many people who, when they get out of jail, use it as graduate school, and they go back to a life of crime. So the main reason was police enforcement, but also there are other theories, a decline in the crack epidemic, notably of the 80s, fewer deaths in the operating room of emergency rooms, I should say, in hospitals that have resulted in people being kept alive longer, which means that the murder rate goes down. Legalizing abortion, which was the theory of Freakonomics, and aging out of people, etc. Also, newer ways to prevent crime, to prevent it from starting, architectural ways of designing buildings, doors going out, and many other things. But at the end of the day, it really was the law enforcement, the broken windows theory, championed by our current police commissioner, appointed by the more liberal Bill de Blasio as opposed to Bloomberg, namely William Bratton. And all these things happen. One thing stands out in particular. I just want to relate a short story to you. When I was walking down a neighborhood in the central part, Manhattan, Lincoln Center, I saw a man outside waving an orange plastic flag. And so I did what I usually do. I walked up to him, I said, what kind of crummy job is this? Waving a flag. And he, who turned out to be a Guatemalan immigrant, was indignant. He said, this is not my main job. I said, it isn't? You know, these flags that are being waved are to entice people, virtually perhaps to command them, considering the enthusiasm of which they're waved, to go into the parking lot and park. He said, my main job is Menton. I said, what's Menton? So like people in foreign countries who, if you don't understand them, think that by saying the same word louder it will help improve comprehension, he yells, Menton. I figured out, if I don't know what Menton is, maybe I'll ask what it does. I said, when you do Menton, what do you do? Oh, I park the cars, I take the tickets. I say, you mean maintenance? He says, yes, Menton. And then a crazy idea hit me. I said, can I wave that flag? I'm walking the whole city. I want to know, you know, I said to myself, what it's like. So I began waving it. First he said to me, are you okay? And I said, it's all right, I'm a professor. Because I learned in walking New York City that you can walk into any place and say anything, and people aren't listening half the time because they're too busy. Can I use your restroom? I said to a person in a real estate office. My daughter's getting married next week. Oh, sure. Can I make a copy of something? We're going to Florida on vacation next year. Sure. So I told him, I'm a professor, let me wave it. Within 1 minute, the flag curled up. And I sheepishly gave it back to him. I learned, professor or not, I don't know how to do this. Then he looked at me and he said, I know who you are. I said, who? He said, you're the boss. You're the boss. And I realized he was referring to a show that had been popular on television in the New York area called Undercover Boss, where a person went in and pretended to be a worker to find out what people are doing. And I said, could be. And he said, be good, my friend. And he wasn't mad at all. And that is because spying on people has become part of the fabric of our life after 9/11 and during the days of the crime epidemic that we suffered from. And what did we do to respond to that? We have cameras everywhere in New York City. And I learned that these cameras are very, very effective. We have thousands of cameras in Manhattan. We have thousands of cameras in the Bronx, in Brooklyn. Every single apartment building in New York has a camera. Every single store has a camera. You can't do anything on camera. And what happened was that after 9/11, people decided that safety trumps privacy. Much as they didn't like it, much as the ACLU didn't like it, they knew there was no traction in fighting this, because if people aren't safe, they can't function in a city. Now, I spoke with a drug dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and I asked him, what do you think about these cameras? He says, I don't like them. I said, you know, a lot of them don't work all the time. He says, that's true. He says, but I want to tell you something. Even if nobody saw you do the crime, the camera did. So the cameras are effective. And again, we're talking safety. Safety is fundamental to a city, no matter what your political stripe may be.
Okay. You talk about, in your book, about two groups of people who are sort of responsible. I don't want to say responsible, but anyway, take part in the renaissance of New York City. And they are newcomers to your city, immigrants and gentrifiers. So I want to start with the first one. How well do immigrants, you say we're a city, Toronto's a city of immigrants, so is New York City. How well do immigrants adapt to life in New York City, do you think?
Immigrants have adapted remarkably well to the city. And one of the reasons, as I wrote in an op-ed piece for the Daily News a couple of months ago, is that in a city where everyone is new, no one is new. And we have less problems with immigrants than, say, a couple of cities in Europe, which I won't mention by name, but a couple of cities in Europe have a lot of problems. They only have 3 or 4 groups, and they are clamoring for their assimilation. We adopted the idea of cultural pluralism, namely that you can maintain your ethnicity as long as it doesn't interfere with the national interest, a long time ago. So we have tolerance for immigrant groups. We know that the city was built by immigrants. And in a way, the 130 immigrant groups speaking 170 different languages cancel each other out. And what happens is that there's more acceptance. You can't reject people if everybody's coming from someplace. That's one reason. The other reason is that immigrants who come from countries that are at odds with each other in the home country, like India and Pakistan, tend to coalesce more because of cultural similarities and get along much better. They also use New York as an opportunity to try out relationships that they simply can't have. You have Chinese and Koreans, Japanese, you have Puerto Ricans and Dominicans who have hostilities between each other, and you have West Indians and Afro-Americans who are already in the country, as well as Haitians and people coming from Guyana. And so we really have become the melting pot, and people are so busy trying to make a living, they really don't have much time left over to hate.
One of the things in Toronto that we like to celebrate in our diversity is that people are as much tied to Toronto and the city that they live in as they are with their home countries, and that connection is still strong, in mostly very good ways. How connected are immigrants in New York City to their home countries?
Well, because of the internet and because of transnational policies, sending money home to the home country and everything, they are very, very connected. There's greater ease of travel, there's greater contract, and there's greater movement between people. Of course, part of this discussion involves what we call the undocumented and what we do about the undocumented. Can't send everybody home. We can't separate parents from their children. These are great problems. New York City has probably more than 600,000 undocumented residents. And we know that. We know that. We can find out. In other words, if you go into a neighborhood and you measure the use of water, and you know that there are 300,000 legal people living there, and they're using 3 times as much water, that doesn't come from a leaky faucet. So we have ways of finding out, and we do know there are large numbers of people, but the most important part is they have one of the lowest crime rates around. They don't commit crimes because they don't want to be deported. And so anybody who wants to stereotype them as a bunch of lazy people who came from another country to make it good here is just dead wrong. These are hard-working people who do a lot of the things that New Yorkers who are established here don't want to do. And if they left, our economy would probably collapse. Even Bloomberg admitted that.
I want to ask you to recount this story about many stores in New York are called Lucky.
That is correct.
Why?
Okay, Lucky is one of the most popular words in China, and a lot of the stores are Chinese. And sometimes they're called Lucky because people think it's going to bring them luck if they run a store like that. People who buy lottery tickets are enticed by stores that are called Lucky. And Lucky, you know, is a term that's used for everything. Immigrants feel that they're lucky to have made it here. I mean, if you gave most people around the world a choice of what country to come to, they'd pick United States, they'd pick Canada, they'd pick Australia, they'd pick countries like this. And if everybody moved here, well, as much as you want them all to be here, the United States can't support 2 billion residents. So at the same time, I pointed out that lucky is sometimes inappropriate. It's inappropriate when you call a fish store Lucky Fish. The fish are not lucky. They're dead. They're chopped up. So it really depends. Of course, immigrants frequently don't understand the nuances of the language. So I saw a Chinese takeout place called Eastern Strawberries. Couldn't figure it out. Strawberries were not on the menu. And that's the way it is. Immigrants will give stores names that sound right.
Well, what's Eastern Strawberries? Did you ask them why they called it that?
Didn't even ask them. I knew already from my experiences that they would call things, you know, Golden Bubbles Laundromat. People don't want golden bubbles. They want
clean clothes.
Clean clothes.
Okay, we only got about 5 minutes left, and I want to talk about the other group that you talk about in your book, and this is gentrifiers. And you know, Brooklyn is probably the stereotype of a borough that got totally gentrified, and you know, all the hipsters moved there and all those things. What are some of the stereotypes that people have about gentrification in New York City?
Well, the one thing, they have many stereotypes about gentrifiers that, you mean, if we're talking about the indigenous people, the people who were there before, they feel that the gentrifiers are rich, that they're snobby, that they don't want anything to do with them. In truth, there is, as with so many stereotypes, a kernel of truth to it. I had written a book called The Things They Say Behind Your Back and about stereotypes, in which I argued that a lot of them have that kernel of truth because they seem always to be directed at certain groups. And certain groups are considered dumb, other groups are considered cheap, other groups are considered violent. And so, is there some truth to this? Yes, but there's a reason for it. There is a reason why the gentrifiers are not so friendly with the indigenous people. 1 is the income gap, 2 is the culture gap, 3 is the ethnic gap. These gaps mean that these people come from different cultures, and it's very hard for them to just be chatted up and go out to a restaurant. As a doorman said to me, supposing a resident in my building takes me to a bar to have a drink. He pays $80 for a bottle of wine. I want one for $12. And he said, piffed, it can't work that way. So I would say that that's one stereotype. Another stereotype is that gentrification has displaced the poor. It turns out that in national studies of gentrification, though New York may be a little more true in that respect. In national studies of gentrification in cities across America, it turns out that a lot of the neighborhoods that are gentrifying actually attract the poor because they think they're going to get better services there and because they think those neighborhoods are safer. At the same time, there's no question that gentrifiers displace the poor. You go into a neighborhood that was poor 5 years ago and they're gone. But the question is, we don't know enough about this displacement process. We don't even know where the poor went. Why? Because we never interviewed them when they left. We fell down on the job. By we, I mean the sociologists, the urban planners. We just don't know enough about gentrification. And what constitutes gentrification anyway? If you move out of a tenement and you move into a Section 8 housing where 20% of the building is reserved for the poor, it's counted as displacement, but displacement into a better apartment? That's not displacement. Or supposing you're not chased out of your building, but you can't drink whiskey in front of the stoop anymore, and instead of an 80 cents coffee in a bodega, you now have to pay $4.50 for it as a latte, you're displaced. Even if you could still live there, you can still live there, but you can't afford to live there. So those are stereotypes. Now, a lot has to do with the gentrifiers. I've talked to gentrifiers who buy pot from people on their block. They're very accepted in the neighborhood. They're economically viable. They enrich the neighborhood's drug dealers. On the other hand, there are other people who say, I don't want anything to do with these people. I'm moving here because I'm on the cusp of gentrification. I can't afford the neighborhoods that have already gentrified. So I'm doing the ones that are going to gentrify. And in fact, real estate people, after this book came out, started asking me to help them determine exactly what block, not neighborhood, but what block in a gentrifying neighborhood will become gentrified. For them, that's big bucks.
Sure. Okay, we only got a couple of minutes left, and I want you to tell me what surprised you most. Walking your own city, walking every last inch of your own city. What did you find surprising?
The friendliness of the people.
That surprised you? New Yorkers are very friendly. We know that.
Yes, I know, but not friendly to the point where not a single person refused to talk to me. I didn't have that experience. The other thing that surprised me was how deeply ingrained the 9/11 experience is. And this is due to several reasons. First of all, so many people died in so many neighborhoods. When I walked into what's called the outer boroughs, not Manhattan, I found everywhere streets dedicated to firefighters, to policemen, to simply stock traders, people who lost their lives there. And you walk down Dean Street in Brooklyn and you see the Henry Miller, in memory of Henry Miller, a firehouse. But it's not the playwright. It's a firefighter named Henry Miller. Now, Giuliani played a major role in this because Giuliani became America's mayor because he kept the city calm after 9/11. Less well known is the fact that he was always a camera buff. He loved to take pictures, and he was particularly fascinated by the World Trade Center, which went up in the 1970s. And he took pictures of it, and then the Leica camera company asked him if he would sponsor an exhibition. So for him, it was personal when the World Trade Center went down. But the other thing is, New York has 771 miles of shoreline. So many thousands, millions of people were able to see the buildings burn from their homes, from their neighborhoods. They stood there and they watched. It was like a gaping hole had been created in what was seen to be part of the permanent landscape of Gotham. And suddenly it was gone. So this left an indelible mark on people. Plus, it's only the second time that the United States has been attacked from abroad, first being Pearl Harbor. And so it really made a huge impression. So one of the things that surprised me was it's never far from the memory. The third thing that surprised me was that New York is a collection of hundreds of different communities, and yet it's part of a very, very sophisticated metropolis. And when people talk about the city, it's my city, I live here. It's not my block. They live in a block that's owned by other people. The real estate is owned by them. But New York has this communal feeling, which a lot of places do. I know Toronto has it in its neighborhoods. And yet the difference is between, say, a community there and a community in Kansas is that you can get on a bus or train and in 40 minutes be in the technological nerve center of the city, in the financial district, and in the heart of the city. I had wanted to know what makes the city tick. What I realized was these people have like two brains. One brain is local, community, neighborhood-oriented, personalized, and that's where the friendliness came in. And the other part of the brain is, I live in a top city. I live in a 21st century city. If you take a bus for 40 minutes out of a town in Nebraska, you can't go very far. You got a long way to go. And where will you end up? Not to say anything disparaging about Omaha. It's a lovely city. I actually once worked there. But it is different than New York City. And that's what makes New York special. Hundreds of communities, and yet a sense of sophistication and cosmopolitanism that you don't find in many other places.
I want to thank you. I love talking to people who are so proud of the cities that they live in and share that with us. And it reminds me, when hearing you talk about New York, how great this city is as well. So thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for having me on the show.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.